Hi everyone, Dr. Brent Siebold back with you. This is How We Innovate at Arizona State University. I am the, get this Hope, I am the Hool Curry Law Professor of Entrepreneurship, and I'm so honored to be with two of our amazing graduate students in the Masters of Science in Innovation and Venture Development. Yes, we teach this crazy method of how to change the world by developing a new product, a new service, a startup, whatever it is that you want to build to make the world a better place. We've got your back here at ASU. So I'm so glad that you two were able to join us, and hope you were integral in setting up an amazing guest that we have with us here today via Zoom. Dr. Hansi Singh is joining us. She is the co-founder of a climate tech startup based out of Canada, but certainly has eyes on changing the world for the better. So Dr. Singh, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to let Hope introduce you, but before we hear from you and they start digging into some of the lessons learned in the realm of doing a climate tech startup or doing any sort of new product or service or venture, Hope, thank you so much for being here. Do you want to tell everybody what you're up to, a little bit about yourself, and then you're doing a startup right now, which is super exciting.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Brent, for this opportunity. My name is Hope Anderson. I am currently, like Brent said, in the MSIVD program, and I have a background in second language acquisition and teaching. So my trajectory up to this point has been very much like our guest today in the academic side. And so I'm trying to figure out how to take the lessons from academia and bring professional development and resources to teachers on a wider scale in a way that I think is going to help democratize access to resources and make teaching, planning for teaching more efficient, because we want fewer teachers to leave the profession screaming in the first few years. And obviously the time element is only one component, but it's the one that I think is the easiest right now to address, more so than money or other factors. And so I'm working on that, and more information TBD forthcoming, but that's my plan right now. And so in my reaching out to other people to try to find out how they did something else beyond academia, that's how I met today's guest.
Fantastic. So we have climate tech that we'll obviously hear about from Dr. Singh. You're working in the ed tech space, an equally powerful domain that needs a lot of innovation, new products to help our society elevate. And then we have Ram Kanda, who's joined us as well, also from the Masters of Science in Innovation and Venture Development program. Ram, you're in the design tech space, right? You're kind of a design guy that's looking to make the process of user experience, user interface better for all sorts of companies. And I think you're focused on healthcare at the moment.
Yeah, so currently we are focusing on digital health. So I'm trying to doing my customer discovery right now, trying to talk to the users directly on where can we enhance and save this planet.
Awesome. So we're bringing it all together. So Hope, so glad to have you and Ram here today. Do you want to kick it off with Dr. Singh?
Yes. So Dr. Singh is a climate scientist who, like I mentioned before, is in that same space of trying to take lessons from academia and bring them into a wider audience to change the world. You're currently at the University of Victoria, right, in Canada?
Yes, I'm in the School of Earth and Ocean Sciences at the University of Victoria.
Wonderful. And so I would like to introduce Hansi Singh and the startup Planet Inc. If you can tell us a little bit about your startup, and then we'll have some questions for you to take it from there.
Thank you so much, Hope, and thank you for having me today. So our startup, the primary goal is to help companies adapt to climate change. So we know already the Earth is like a little more than a degree warmer than it was, just a century ago. And because of that, we're already seeing so many impacts of climate change. And guess what? Like, we are headed probably, optimistically a 2-degree world, pessimistically a 3-degree world, right? So, we can expect that these climate change impacts are going to become larger and larger. And so the goal of our company is really to help companies navigate this complex changing climate landscape in order to remain profitable, because guess what? They are the foundation of our economy. Like we need our economy to grow, right? Like, I mean, we have so many people around the world still in poverty. We need to raise all those people out of poverty. You know, we need to do a lot of development everywhere to have that happen. And we need to do it in a sustainable way. And at the same time, though, you know, we can't have economic apocalypse because of what we are doing in that process. And so our goal is to help companies adapt. And so first of all, we hope to show companies what their risks are in terms of a changing climate. So this includes both the physical risks. So some of those risks would be chronic, like for example, oh, I have operations in this region where there is a drought. We are projected to continue having said drought, say for the next, you know, couple of decades, you know, and my manufacturing requires a lot of water. I don't know, man, the red flags are flying real high there, right? So, you know, you might want to change your strategies there. So those are some of the kinds of risks that we try to help companies identify in this stage. So those types of risks, for example, oh, like my company in my sector is one of like, you know, the highest emitting companies. Well, you know, like, look, the direction that we're going in is, you know, a lot of jurisdictions have these net zero type targets, right? Like, you know, you're gonna need to figure out how to reduce this carbon footprint over, you know, this some reasonable time scale. So first of all, we help companies identify, and then once we've helped them identify, we help them come up with plans for achieving these de-risking strategies. So to mitigate risk, for example, you know, you pull operations out of places where, you know, like the operation is not suited for this new brave climate that we have created, right? And then the other thing that you do is you work on decreasing your carbon footprint. And so that's kind of a complicated sort of task because you have to think about local energy policy, you have to think about company sector specific needs, and then you also have to think about like, you know, how the climate is changing in terms of where different operations are best suited. And so it's kind of a complex problem. It's almost like an optimization problem. And we hope to actually be able to do these for companies so that they have a good sort of strategy moving forward as they're navigating this rapidly changing space. So that is our goal. It is to make the economy more resilient to the effects of climate change by helping companies adapt.
That's amazing. If I might, Dr. Singh, you are an expert climatologist. I think we're now enlightened with this challenge that these corporate clients of yours are faced with as we persist into the future. Could you characterize the solution that you've developed within Planet at the moment? It sounds to me, I have many colleagues who are experts in their fields who spend a considerable amount of time consulting to industry affiliates and partners and sponsors here at our university. Could you talk a little bit about your product offering or your service offering within the startup?
So we're still in relatively early stages. We're in sort of pre-seed stages. And so because of that, there's not actually a product offering yet. We're going, as we stated earlier, in the consulting route so that we get a better sense of exactly sort of what this offering will be. But just in a nutshell, right, what we aim to create is this kind of unified framework where it contains the climate science, right? So present day risks, future risks due to climate change, both acute in terms of extreme type events, as well as chronic. And then we also want to include the energy landscape in there. So for example, you know, like, is your jurisdiction on the road to net zero? Well, that's great, because guess what? They're going to pull you along, right? They have all the right policies. You'll get pulled along. Like, you know, that's probably the best place to be, right? Versus, you know, are you in a place that doesn't support this, in which case you're going to have more work to do in terms of helping your own net zero transitioning. And then on top of that, there's a lot of like, you know, sector specific needs, company specific needs that we need to take into account. And so the fundamental sort of back end of this, you know, kind of technological innovation is to bring all those three things together. And so that is the fundamental innovation. And then once you have that innovation, then the consulting work is then to sort of figure out exactly how we can satisfy the needs of these different companies. And produce something that is actually scalable. Because I mean, you know, like, sure, we could become just a forever consulting company, but really the point is to produce something scalable that can grow. And, honestly, like the goal is to make these types of services not something that's just for, oh, like I can afford a $5 million McKinsey contract, right? This is not the point of this. We want to actually like democratize this so that it's much more available. And the way to do that is to produce a scalable product where it's much more straightforward to kind of get these assessments.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Exciting, yeah.
So when we talked before, you were telling me sort of about juggling academia and being the co-founder of a startup.
Oh.
And I was just wondering, obviously we all have these wonderful ideas of ways that we could take what we're learning academically and try to change the world. But what made you actually take that step to do it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing that I've noticed, like, for those of us that are already, PIs, right? We're professors, we lead labs, we fund our labs, right? We write these big grants, we get them funded, we're managers, we are basically the leading a research vision, right? I mean, that's what an academic lab does. And so we already do this kind of work. Like we're already kind of entrepreneurs, right? Within the context of our universities and in the broader scientific community. So at a certain point, I kind of realized that, right? That, oh yeah, like I have these skills. Like I know how to sell my science. I know how to, manage people. I know how to pull together this group. I mean, it's not the same thing as a company, obviously, but I know how to do all of these things. And there's things that I want to do that are not necessarily limited to, writing academic papers that like 2 people read. And honestly, like this is one of the major, I think, downsides of academia, particularly when you're in an area that has so much reach. Like right now, I mean, everybody is talking about climate, right? And that's good. Because honestly, climate scientists have been yelling about it for a long time and no one's listened, but now everyone's talking about it. So that's good. But, everyone's talking about it, but then what you end up getting if us climate scientists just hang out in academia and don't contribute to this dialogue is that, you have things going on all these different directions, right? And some of that is really good, but some of that is like super unfocused and you're not actually getting the expertise that you need to make some of these decisions. So for example, when it comes to like adaptation to climate change, like you literally need to figure out what the hell you're adapting to. Like until you know what you're adapting to, then what is the point of making these plans, right? Like you don't know. And so that requires knowing the state of the art science, that requires knowing, all of these other factors that I talked about, like the energy landscape, the policy landscape, all of these other factors. And together, putting all these together is what we want to do. And there's no place in academia to do that. Right? That's another limitation of academia. We're in these silos. And suddenly, you're like, my piece of the puzzle fits into this larger thing. It's very important for how society adapts moving forward. And there's not room for it in academia. Right? Honestly, I'm like so tired of the academia monopoly money, which is like the papers that we write, because it's like super, important within the context of academia, right? It's like, oh, how many monopoly dollars do you have, But then as soon as you come out, it's like, that's not what matters. What matters is your impact, right? So I think there's a lot of room in many of our fields for making an impact outside of academia.
That's cool.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ram.
So I've been doing great stuff. You have took a step to do this. So we want to understand, the challenges and strengths of working with a team, and we want to know more about your team. So.
Yeah. So I am super fortunate. So last year, one of my colleagues introduced me to a PI at the Palo Alto Research Center, which is this Silicon Valley-based research institute for AI and computing. They're actually owned by Xerox. So you know how a lot of like major companies, they tend to have these big research arms. So this is the research arm of Xerox. And in fact, they're the ones that invented the GUI. And back in the day, yeah, see, this is why they're notorious, because this research institute is very interesting because they invent all this cool stuff, but then other people end up like, taking it and making a lot of money from it. So literally Steve Jobs like appeared there and saw the demo of the GUI. And that's why Apple was the first one to really develop this as opposed to Xerox. So you might have heard that Xerox was the one that invented the GUI. That's because it was invented at a park and Steve Jobs was hanging out there. So
Classic story.
Classic. Yeah. Classic of like how not to do entrepreneurship, right? Which is like, or maybe how to do it if you're, Steve Jobs, like go hang out in cool spaces where people are doing like innovative things and then, rip what you can, I guess. So I was super fortunate to, meet this PI. We started working on this grant proposal together for DARPA, the U.S. Department of Defense. And so we actually wrote the grant, we won the grant, and we had such a great time doing it that, it's lovely when you have a colleague that you really click with. And so what ended up happening was that, clearly we clicked, and then we started, talking about what I was talking about earlier, which is like thinking about our work and how it could have impact outside these kind of more academic type spheres. And, okay, I'm going to make a Breaking Bad reference, right? So, like if you're Walt, you're stuck in like, oh, I'm a high school teacher. And then suddenly, you see Jesse over there kind of at this, doing things where you're like, that looks interesting, right? And so, like at Park, because it is, a research lab that is linked to industry, they actually do some pure research and then they actually do some applied research. They actually there's actually startup spinoffs that come out of Park in itself. And so it was really interesting. Like I actually learned a lot simply by talking to Kalai. That's the PI that I have been working with. And so from doing that, it sort of made me realize like, oh yeah, like it is actually, there is a world out there. It is possible to have more impact. And so I was super fortunate that we got this grant together. We worked really great together. And then we started ideating together. I think that was like the most amazing organic way to do this, right? Because I keep on hearing these stories about people like, oh, our investors really need me to have a co-founder. So I need to find a co-founder and like, how do I, go on a weekend retreat to find a co-founder, right? It's like, these super forced, weird, like the Bachelorette for a co-founder or something. I mean, it's just, yeah, it's doesn't sound fun. I mean, I've heard this other story where, like people just have to pay a lot of money for a co-founder, right? You're like, oh, I found the right person, but like they won't come on board for anything less than $200K a year, right? Which is like, okay, great. There goes my first, grant money that I got. So yeah, we're super fortunate that we work really well together. And the other thing is that, I'm on the climate science side of the space, and she is on like, the AI side with a whole bunch of expertise in energy. So we have like kind of the dream team here. One thing that I hope that we would like to get is someone with some more expert in finance. So that I feel like would be kind of the third leg of the tripod that we hope to at some point flesh out a little bit. But yeah, I think we have a really good rapport, and we have the right expertise that's very complementary to be able to do this work that we want to do.
That's awesome.
Yeah, Ram, I'm so
Sometimes
glad
you just get lucky,
Yeah, I'm so glad Ram asked that question because, in fact, as an extension of this particular video series and podcast, we run a biannual event called Techie Palooza, and the point of that is to bring potential co-founders together with a focus on, the technical side. We have a lot of idea folks here at ASU, but I loved your characterization of bachelorette, because you're right. Founder dating requires a lot of work, and a lot of times folks that are wanting to solve for X, skip over the part of really zeroing in on who wants to stand shoulder to shoulder with me to solve this big problem, regardless of where they might come from. So the story of you and it sounds like your co-founder at the moment is spot on. So and looking for that third potential leg of the stool, so to speak, or as we say at ASU, the third tine of the pitchfork, is a great journey to hear that you're on, like so many of our student and faculty co-founders at the university.
Yeah.
So Hope, you want to jump in with
actually I do. So it's really interesting to hear sort of some of the things that you've gone through up to this point. A lot of us in our cohort are in the very early stages, much earlier, in figuring out basically what the problem is that we want to solve and how we can provide a solution that has that problem solution fit and eventually the product market fit. And you were telling me that when we spoke a few minutes ago that the product market fit and the customer discovery are not as straightforward to assess in your field, because there's not a lot of, you can't just go out on the street and meet a whole bunch of people who have companies with this problem. So could you give us a little bit of insight that might help others in our cohort or other entrepreneurs who are in a similar stage of their venture in terms of how to reach out and do that customer discovery in a field that you can't just go out onto the street and find 100 possible customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, we have just done a little bit of the bare minimum, which is literally to get a version of LinkedIn Premium where you have unlimited mail opportunities, or not unlimited, but you can send a lot. And then, cold emails. That's what we've been doing. And we've actually gotten some responses, some people being like, no, we're not really very interested in knowing about our climate risks. And then we've gotten some people that are super interested and been like, show me your product. And it's like, there's no product yet, but thank you for letting us know, because we'll keep you in mind. That is one thing that we're doing. However, one thing to really point out is that if we want to really have in-depth conversations with people, our next step is actually to use something like Zintro. So Zintro is a resource where they have a collection of subject matter experts there. And what you can actually do is you have to pay, right? These people get paid, but then they get paid. So literally you don't even have to answer any of their questions. You can literally just ask them questions. That is what they're paid for. They're paid well. They're happy to be there because they're getting paid, and you can get your questions answered. So that is the next stage that we're doing. And so we actually have some money to do that now. And so that is the work that we're going to be engaged in going forward, to get a little bit more of that in-depth sort of customer pain points and product market fit information that we want.
Great.
That's great. Thanks for telling about the resource.
Yeah, Zintro. Yeah, go to Zintro. It is a little bit expensive, but guess what? Get some pre-seed and spend it on that. Don't spend it on your website. Yeah. Well, maybe you should spend it on your website if it's your B2C or something. Anyway, but make sure you spend some on there, depending on what your needs are. Yeah.
Pro tip.
Great.
What else do you have on your list, Hope, for our guests?
I have a long list, and I keep asking things that aren't even on it too. So we could be here all day. We won't be, but we could be. I wanted to ask you. So I know you're still in pretty early stages, but what has been the most rewarding part so far? And while you're answering that, you can also think about the next question, which is most challenging.
Yeah, rewarding. It's been interesting to see how ideas over time evolve, right? So, initially when we started this, right, it was like, okay, I have, this climate expertise and information, somebody wants it, right? And so then it took my co-founder to be like, No, you need to have a value proposition. You need to have, some sense of who your customers are. You need to have, this product market fit. You need to get traction, right? It's more complicated than that. It's quite interesting because I think in academia, we really get away with, saying, hey, y'all, I have a great idea, giving me money. Whereas, in the real world, people are like, oh, well, if you have a great idea, let's actually, get a sense of how you might make that idea reality, right? And so, for example, like, if you're in these various stages of funding, right, people want to see like, oh, do you have a proof of concept? Do you have a prototype? Do you have an MVP, right? I mean, there's actually like people who are like, if you want more money, you need to show me the money, right? So it's kind of a very different process. And I'm actually like finding it really interesting and rewarding, just in the sense of, I think it sort of keeps you real. Like you actually have to show these really concrete things in order to sort of move forward. And so I like that. I also like the fact that, in academia, like with grants, I mean, some projects you have a program manager that really reinforces deadlines, but often, like us academics, people are like, oh yeah, like you'll always ask for more money and it'll always be late, that kind of thing, right? But I guess I appreciate the pressure of just like, let's get it done. And so I think that's been also refreshing for me, because I'm one of those people like I complain about other academics. I'm like, they told me that they would get this done by this date and it's not done and I'm upset, but yeah, so I think it fits better with my personality as well. So it was super exciting when we first, incorporated. There's all these milestones that get exciting. We actually just got some money, so that's exciting too, right? So all of these things. I mean, I think you have to celebrate the process, because this is like running a marathon through a minefield, right? So, yeah.
Great analogy.
Yeah. No, that's interesting what you were saying about grants, because I was thinking about the fact that I have not had a lot of success getting grants in the past, because they keep telling me that there's not enough of a research component, that all I'm trying to do is, just make education better, that there's no, there's nothing really fundable there in terms of research. I mean, I'm overgeneralizing, but that's the problem, is I get so focused on the outcomes in terms of what I'm actually trying to do. We're doing it this way instead of this way. Let's see if it's better this way. And they say, it's not really generalizable research. So
right. But you know what? In the real world, like that's the work that you actually have to do to, for example, like make a product that people use, right? Like, yeah. So I think this is one of those areas where like academia has a lot of limitations, right? And so it's good to notice those things.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Because I actually think that focus that you're talking about on like, how can we make this, a resource for people to learn? Well, weirdly, it's not academia where you actually might get the traction for getting that kind of work funded, but it might actually be within the private sector. So, yeah.
I don't want to lose sight of Hope's second part in terms of the challenges you've faced in this process to date. And I think, Ram, you had teed up a question about lessons learned, maybe some takeaways from the process. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there was a super funny interview that we did where, so we were talking to someone from one of the big four accounting firms, right? So these are the people that, if the SEC climate risk disclosures, so these are basically climate risk disclosures where on your company's annual financial statements, you'd be required to report your current year losses and expenditures due to climate change. You'd be required to report your risks due to climate change now and into the future. And then you'd be required to report your transition risks and your greenhouse gas emissions. So, like these are the companies that often are the ones that either audit those types of financial statements, right? Or they actually, for some companies, they both produce and audit, Don't ask me how that works, right? But regardless, that's how our financial system works right now. And so, like we went and we talked to them and we're like, yeah, we're a startup and we have, these awesome ideas. Well, guess what? Like, don't maybe, like my lesson there was like they weren't impressed, right? And not only that, but I realized like, oh, well, that's because they're our competitors. So like, don't go tell your competitor, right? Like what you're doing and expecting them to be happy for you, right? Like basically, I think they came to us being like, is there some free academic research that we can use to produce, some of these auditing tools and some of these prep tools for these upcoming disclosures? Whereas we're like, oh, we're going to do these for companies, right? I mean, obviously, yeah, that so it's just like you need to learn how to read the market better. I mean, these are just like newbie errors where you're like, well, I guess we talked to the wrong people. So anyway, I felt sad for a while after that, and then I realized like, oh wait, there are competitors. Like I would have reacted the same way if I was like a larger company and some like little upstart came and was like, I'm going to do what you do but do it better. Like that's not a good approach. So anyway, I think with the startup journey, I think one has to expect a lot of like small scale ups and downs, right? And this is something that I think we have to adapt to, right? This is where like, self-care and all of those, warm and fluffy things are so important because this will take you into really high ups and really low downs sometimes. And so you really need to figure out how to kind of, steady yourself and keep yourself stable in the context of all of that will happen around you as you're building.
Well, that's really interesting. I wanted to go back to a little bit about juggling academia and running the startup because that's the journey that I'm on right now. And it might be interesting for some of our, whether they're in academia or not, our listeners who are still juggling their full-time position as well as trying to start their startup. And do you have any advice besides self-care?
Yeah. Evenings. That's my advice, literally, right? So I work during the day and then I work on my startup in the evenings. I mean, that's literally. Now, the other thing is that some of the proof of concept work, right? I mean, given that there's my climate science expertise is literally one of the things that the startup is fundamentally built on, means that I can, kind of kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. So, for example, some of our proof of concept work is work that is academic in nature. And so, I mean, this is work that I'm going to write up in an academic journal. Probably no one's going to read it, but guess what? Like some of this is what we're going to actually use to produce, our big, engine, our climate risk engine. So, I mean, that's one kind of nice thing. I can imagine that if someone is working at a job where there's like no overlap at all, like it's really, hard. But I mean, you'd be amazed, if you really want this to work, like I've heard so many startups that do stuff like this, right? Like, people have a job and then like literally their evenings, they put the kids to bed and then it's another 2 or 3 hours on their startup.
Yeah. I mean, the term moonlighting and side hustling has been around, and it sounds like you're reinforcing that in order to lead a successful startup, eventually you're going to have to find that fifth gear. And this is really where, a lot of times when people think about entrepreneurship, it's all about the idea and kind of the sexiness of coming up with something new that's never been done before. But at the end of the day, Dr. Singh, it sounds like you're talking about just flat out hard work and really being thoughtful about leveraging your expertise that you've accumulated in your day job to then ultimately feed into the value proposition of this company. So taking that a step further, can you talk a little bit about how you manage the intellectual property? It sounds like both you and your co-founder have developed intellectual property. You in the confines of the academy, likely funded by tax dollars to support your work in your lab, and then it sounds like your co-founder in an industry-based lab. Are you disclosing intellectual property and then potentially having to license that back through those individual organizations, or is there a firewall between the IP you're creating for the startup and the IP you're creating during the day?
Yeah, that's a really good question. With my startup, it's so intertwined with the expertise that I use in my daily job, right? Yeah, this is a very good question, and this is something that we're still working on navigating. So there's a sequence of 2 papers that I'm working on. Some of this is work that we will be using in the context of our company. However, it's like a small ingredient within a much larger framework that we're building for our company. And that's the part that we're going to patent, that larger framework. This smaller part that I'm developing as, proof of concept in the context of academia, I mean, this is all going to be open source science. So anybody could use this, right? So yeah, we're not viewing that part as being the part that's patentable. The part that's patentable is this kind of climate risk engine that we're building.
Cool.
So that's how we're kind of keeping it separate. It would be much harder, I think, if I had a physical lab where I was doing work and then that work also was coming into my company. That's when, the university definitely would own some IP and all of that. But in this case, I think there's a reasonable enough separation between the work that I do for my company versus the work that I do in the academic setting.
Exciting. That's great news. Because once you start to get the technology transfer lawyers involved, it can get pretty messy. But for the good of our society, so
it is good. And actually, look, I know people that do have wet labs, and their wet lab work is directly what goes into their company, and they've done all of the IP negotiations. And for example, one nice thing about that is in our case, we will literally have to patent everything ourselves, whereas for them, the university does all of that, right? So I mean, that's I don't know, $100,000 over the course of I don't know, a few years. Plus, they can actually wield the IP. They actually have the money to check to make sure there's no violations, as opposed to probably our little company. We just have to put it out there and pray that nobody's actively violating. I don't know. But this is something that we're still going to have to navigate for sure. So there are advantages to having a big institution like a university have your back in terms of IP.
That is very instructive. Thanks.
Yeah. This has been great. I think, Hope, we have just a few minutes left with Dr. Singh. Mm-hmm. So you want to close us out, both you and Ram, maybe with one final question for our guest?
Yeah. So we just want to know if our listeners wants to learn more about climate tech. So how can they reach out to you? That's number one. Also, I want to ask if you can just share some resources to learn more about climate tech.
Yeah. So if you start going online and say you start looking at VCs, right? Many VCs at this stage are funding various types of climate tech, right? This is a very hot area right now, understandably. So there's a lot of resources online. For example, one resource that we are now members of is Women in Climate Tech. So there is actually an organization for women in climate tech. So that's exciting. I mean, this, I think, shows just how this world is really growing. Another area, because I'm interested in corporate disclosures, there's a lot of online resources on TCFD, which is the disclosure framework that was developed for Europe. This is what European companies follow. And this will be, in the future, probably what eventually becomes what US companies will have to follow. It's a little bit less rigorous than the SEC guidelines, but it's still quite good. So there's a lot of resources on that if one is interested in, climate analytics in particular. I'm trying to think about other resources. The other thing is there's literally climate tech conferences going on continually.
Conferences, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's just so much going on in this space. It's just almost hard to point to like a single resource. Honestly, half the time I'm just like, oh, I guess that conference passed. I should have probably been there. Um, so yeah, it's really kind of ballooning in size because I mean, this is going to be like for our generation, for the next generation, like this is the reality that we're going to have to figure out how to, deal with and adapt to. So,
This is one of those problem statements. If we get the solution wrong, we're all dead. So it's kind of, luckily, the conversation is amping up, and we're so honored to meet somebody at the forefront of that discussion and solving for X. So it's exciting.
Yeah.
Hope.
So yeah, I just wanted to follow up on one more thing, just kind of in closing that we had talked about before. That I thought it was fascinating that you said that the first goal is to help them meet their reporting requirements, and then the next goal is to help them actually reduce their carbon footprints. And so I wanted to know if we were to follow up with you in a year or two or three, what do you think that the goals? Obviously, it's a moving target when it's a startup, but what do you think that trajectory is going to look like in terms of will you be working with companies at what stage of this process?
yeah, so what we would like to do is to be able to combine that climate, energy, business sector engine in order to produce sort of a net zero transition plan for companies. And the thing is, in terms of disclosure requirements, one element of the SEC disclosures is literally if a company claims anywhere that they have net zero ambitions, they need to show a plan. So guess what? We're going to provide a plan. And then, in fact, one thing that we could do over the longer term is provide ways to verify, right, that the plan is being followed, right? Ways to also modify the plan based on, say, like local energy policies or based on, cutting edge climate science of like, what we think is possible in these different regions. So yeah, that is kind of the goal. And one thing that I'll say about those net zero plans is that we don't want them to be fundamentally only based on carbon credits, right? They really need to be based on energy efficiency, renewable and clean type energies, and then a part should also be based on carbon credits, but this should be no more than 20%. And so one thing that distinguishes, I think, that part of our goal is really to, is that we're not reliant on carbon credits. You'll see many companies that are like, get to net zero, we'll sell you 100% of your emissions in carbon credits. And it's like, well, actually, there's not enough carbon credits in the world to be able to do that. Yeah, that is impossible. So yeah, we got to just have like all hands on deck, all methods on deck to be able to solve this problem. So this is where we would like to go because we want to help this transition happen.
That is awesome.
Very exciting. Well, again, Dr. Hansi Singh, thank you so much for joining us on the How We Innovate podcast here at Arizona State University. We really appreciate your time and obviously your talent and obviously all of the after hours work you're putting in with your co-founders and collaborators and likely students and other folks who are on the front lines of fighting this battle that is going to affect all of us. So I want to give a special shout out to Hope Anderson, one of our student founders within MSIVD, for making the introduction to you, Dr. Singh, and getting you into the studio here with us today virtually. But it was a great experience, Ram. Yeah. I really enjoyed having both.
Yeah, even I enjoyed it a lot, like knowing more about, this is really important. But, when I came across like Hansi Singh's profile on LinkedIn, when I was reading the bio, I was like, dude, there's so much to learn. There is so much happening on the planet. There are people working on it.
Yeah.
So
there she is. She's with us today.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's super exciting to be here. Thank you for having me. It's fun to talk about this journey, and I hope it helps somebody in terms of, wherever they are in the process.
It will. We hit a lot of great common friction points and lessons that our entrepreneurial students at the university are thirsty to drink or consume, however you want to put that. So really appreciate all of your time and energy, and thanks again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you so much.
All right. We'll see you at the next climate change conference. It's probably tomorrow. So
yeah, it's probably tomorrow, and I don't know about it, and I'll find out the day after, right? That's usually how it always happens. Anyway, thank you.
All right. We'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Bye bye.